Hey everyone, welcome to The New Populist. I'm Dave Brown, co-author of the book, Black and White, How the Left is Destroying the Dream of Martin Luther King and Our Founding Fathers. If you want a right-leaning perspective on race relations, go ahead and pick up a copy. It is available on Amazon, and there is a link in the description. And of course, if you are new to this channel, please share, like, and subscribe. I thought today would be a good day to talk about critical race theory and immigration, seeing as we have this fiasco on the southern border, upwards of 10,000 migrants on the Mexico and Texas border. And what's interesting is that most of these migrants are from Haiti. And you stop and go, well, how did they get from Haiti, a island nation hundreds of miles away, to the Texas border? And it makes you wonder what our Coast Guard is doing, and if the Mexican government is partially complicit in allowing them safe passage to get to that point. We don't know. Those are questions that need to be asked, and of course, we will not get any answers. And not only that, the Biden administration looks to be trying to limit some of the news coming out of there. Fox News was flying a drone over the area, taking aerial shots, and the FAA, inexplicably, all of a sudden issued a temporary ban on any flights over that area. The obvious question is, why? There's no issue for the last 7 months, but now there's an issue. So it seems that the Biden administration is using the FAA as a weapon to protect them and what they're doing down there. Maybe we need a special counsel to find out. Yeah, wishful thinking, that'll never happen. But back to the issue of critical race theory and immigration, I went back and read a paper from 1995 written by Ruben Garcia, a professor at UNLV. And the title for this paper is Critical Race Theory and Proposition 187, the Racial Politics of Immigration Law. And two things I want to point out. First is that this was 26 years ago. And one thing I always point out is that critical race theory is not a new phenomena. It's been around for a long time, percolating in left-wing academia, and just now we're paying attention to it. And unfortunately, when we wait so long to sort of get a grasp on what's going on, we're sort of behind the eight ball playing catch up. So that's what we're doing, but that's the position we're in. Nothing we can do about that except start to fight back and start to educate ourselves on what this is and where it's coming from. And the other thing, if you're not familiar with Proposition 187, this was a ballot initiative that was passed in California that limited services to undocumented immigrants. And it actually passed, it got 58% of the vote, but it was immediately challenged in federal court. It was held up, and then eventually in 1999, under Gray Davis, the law was just basically abandoned. They stopped fighting it in court. So we never got to see what would happen if it had gone to the Supreme Court. Would the Supreme Court have had upheld that law, or they have struck it down? We can only speculate. But this gives us, this paper gives us a good insight into critical race theory and their position on immigration. And he says a lot of things here that are pretty interesting and pretty pointed. And again, if you think that critical race theory is not a radical philosophy, once again, some of the things he says here reaffirms that. So let's get started. This first excerpt, he talks about critical race theory and Proposition 187. And he says, the racial issues surrounding Proposition 187 have centered around two opposing views. The proponents of Proposition 187 contend the measure has nothing to do with race, arguing that the proposition is merely an attempt to save scarce state resources and uphold the law. The opponents view the initiative as an attack on racial and cultural minorities, seeing it as part of a historical continuum of race-based immigration policies. This section will examine the debate through the lens of critical race theory, using the history and context of immigration law discussed in the previous two sections. So, according to critical race theory, the these laws, immigration-based laws, are about race, not about upholding law and order. That's the first thing. So, and initially, the reason he's saying this is that in the past, and this is true, we had a lot of immigration laws that were racist, whether it was the Chinese coming into California to work, whether it was obviously African-American slaves in the South. We did have a lot of messed up laws. And thankfully, over time, these were changed. Again, things incrementally got better, but as I pointed out in other videos, critical race theory rejects incrementalism. They think the whole thing is rotten and want to radically change the system. And he goes on to say here, and this really is just down to you, and we'll explain a lot of things that critical race theorists and leftists say about Republicans and conservatives that make us, scratch our heads going, what, were this? Because what reason? Well, listen to what he says here. Critical race theory aims to understand the structure and content of legal thought so that the law may be used more effectively for racial and other types of reform. Critical race theorists also aim to deconstruct the cornerstones of liberal jurisprudence, such as colorblindness and the rule of law, and show how they operate to disadvantage non-whites and further solidify white supremacy. Now, if you're wondering why they call people like Tucker Carlson white supremacists for pointing out our immigration system being out of control and the amount of illegal immigration, well, here's your answer. That if you support liberal jurisprudence, if you support colorblindness and the rule of law, they further solidify white supremacy. So that begs the question, if they're against liberal jurisprudence, what are they for? Well, if you understand critical race theory, what that means is that they want a judiciary to see race and to be activists on this court and to take into account race when making decisions. They don't believe in a colorblind judiciary, and they don't believe in enlightenment of principles. They believe in a activist judiciary to shape laws. And if you don't go with them, if you don't believe that, well, guess what you're doing? You're solidifying white supremacy. So when they're teaching our kids in school critical race theory, I've heard people say, well, it's critical race theory is bad. They're teaching these white children to hate themselves. Well, not exactly. Maybe downstream from critical race theory that happens, but critical race theory itself is doing something actually much worse than that. They're saying that supporting the system as it is, basic ideas like a colorblind society and a colorblind judiciary, that you're supporting white supremacy. That in fact, to me, is much more radical than just saying that, oh, you're telling kids to hate themselves. That's a sort of, it doesn't go far enough to explain the radicalness of critical race theory. So when we on the right, when we say that, we kind of dismiss the more important arguments that we should be paying attention to. And then he goes on to say here, critical race theory is a theoretical framework that explores the ways that purportedly race-neutral laws and policies perpetuate racial subordination. The repeated assertions that anti-immigration measures are not racially motivated make immigration law and policy a unique candidate for analysis through a critical race lens. So, critical race theory is saying race-neutral laws. That's what people like me and you will say, where our immigration policy we would support isn't aiming at any particular person, but the critical race theory, no, that is about perpetuating racial subordination. And the question we always have for people on the left, what is considered good enough? How many people come here illegally before we say, okay, we've allowed enough racial mixing? There's never an answer to that question. This was 26 years ago. Things have, since then, there's been tens of millions of people added to this country from other parts of the world. When is it good enough? There's no answer to that question. It's open-ended, and that's the problem. And that sort of, I think, betrays their motivation. If they could sort of tell you and give you a clear definition of when we reach some sort of racial equity, we could at least go, okay, we're here and we need to get there. But they never define things that clearly, because their ultimate goal is not this racial equity they're talking about. It's this racial equity in their minds and all the power that comes along with it. And perhaps that's the most important thing. He goes on to say, this comment argues that Proposition 187 was not passed to punish undocumented immigrants, nor out of a wish to return to the rule of law, as many of its proponents argued. Rather, it was propelled by fears of the increasing racial diversity of California and the United States. In this way, Proposition 187 is consistent with the racism underlying the history of United States immigration law. Well, I have to admit, the racial makeup of California has shifted over, so if that was a fear, it has happened. But again, rule of law is not the issue for them. So if you support the rule of law, you're supporting racist policies. And again, that puts us in this weird position where, what do you support then? Where's the line? What rules do we follow? And it's ambiguous to critical race theorists. He goes on to say here, the preceding history of immigration policy renders suspect the characterization of the current debate over Proposition 187 as race neutral. As was the case during Chinese exclusion, concepts such as sovereignty have historically served as proxies for racism. The rule of law is being used today in much the same way that sovereignty functioned during the Chinese exclusion, as a concept that is inconsistently applied to exclude and penalize only non-whites from American society. For example, if the rule of law is the basis for the current vitriol against undocumented, then the employers who hire undocumented immigrants should be also attacked by the public. However, while there were several border crackdowns in the weeks before the vote on Proposition 187, there was not concurrent raid on employers who hired the undocumented. Now, I wanted to point this out because I think he actually makes a good point. We crack down on the illegal immigrant, but we don't crack down on all the businesses that employ them illegally. And we can obviously point to the Chamber of Commerce, other organizations that support open borders for business reasons. They want cheap labor. But that being said, there are those on the right who have pointed out, fairly, that if we're going to crack down on illegal immigrants, we have to crack down on the businesses that support them. And in that case, he actually makes a good point, and I would agree with him. So, a matter of fact, more than that, we can never fault people looking for a better life. I think we all understand that. If we were in certain conditions in other parts of the world, we would want to come here too. So we can't really blame them. So let's never make them the target of our opposition or derision. We need to go after the people who are supporting it, who are in a position of power, like these corporations who want cheap labor. Those are the people that we should actually be focusing on, not the immigrant himself. He's doing what's good for himself and his family. You can't blame him for that. Let's focus on the scumbags way up in the chain who have all that power, who are manipulating things for their own benefit. That's where our focus should be. He goes on here and says this. The fictions of non-recognition and colorblindness were a prevalent part of the campaign for Proposition 187. Jesse Laguna, a member of the Save Our State Committee, wrote that Proposition 187 has nothing to do with race. If Latinos are caught more often, it is because they illegally cross the border more often. Most of the Anglos I work with on the Save Our State Committee would feel exactly the same way if the border invaders were Canadians setting up camp in Montana and hauling for freebies. This statement ignores the reality that the Canadian border is a very porous one and is ill-patrolled compared to the militarized United States-Mexico border. So the last statement there, or the last sentence, ignoring the reality of the Canadian border, well, there's no problem with the Canadian border. There's not tens of thousands of people pouring across the Canadian border. If they were, maybe we would have a larger presence up there. So his argument there doesn't really make any sense. There, you don't put resources where there's not a problem. You put them where the problem exists, and that's on the southern border. And he characterizes the Mexican border, United States-Mexico border, as being militarized. Not really. There's laws against using the military for apprehending legal immigrants. In fact, they can't. I think under George Bush, they were put there where they could look, they can get their binoculars out and look for people and find them, but they couldn't actually apprehend them themselves. The Border Patrol had to do that, a civilian law enforcement agency, not the military. So I would argue that the United States-Mexico border being militarized does not reflect the truth. He says here, the calls for curbing undocumented immigration are concurrent with the rhetoric that programs and services such as bilingual education result in the balkanization of America. Many who espouse this position also support an end or a severe cutback to legal immigration as well. Well, balkanization is a problem. And this is something that's kind of frustrating because we observe over the world, the entire planet, and going back through history, that when you have an area or nation or part of the world where there's competing languages and cultures and religions, it is a cluster bleep. It's always a source of problems. And this is not a racial thing. It's just a reality that you need people to function well in society, and to do so, they have to have a familiarity in culture and language. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with anybody, say an African country, saying to their immigrants, if you're going to an African country, hey, if you want to come to Nigeria, you need to learn our language and learn our custom and culture. Every country does that. If for some reason it's only bad when the United States does that. Certainly, countries in Central America have a lot of pride in their culture, and they have a demand that if you come there, that you become part of their country. So this demand for assimilation seems to be only directed at European and Western countries, not everywhere else in the world. Everywhere else in the world they can do that, but we can't for some reason. Funny. And I mentioned assimilation. He says here, while assimilation may be good for immigrants in that it opens up economic opportunities, assimilationism is also tied to rendering non-whites invisible to the greatest extent possible. Assimilationism confers a psychological benefit upon members of mainstream society, privileging the notion that the immigrant should aspire to American culture and deny his or her own culture. Assimilationism is also a proxy for the fear of shifting demographics, which will make whites the minority in some areas of the country. This is the predicted fate of California, where demographers predict that the majority of the state residents will trace their roots to Latin America, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, and the Pacific Islands by the beginning of the next century. Assimilationism. If you demand that people assimilate, you're telling them to abandon their culture, and that somehow we're trying to make people invisible. I'm not sure if we have the same definition of what it means to assimilate. If you look at people from Ireland, from Italy, they're very proud of their ethnic origins or their country of origin. There's a lot of white groups that are very proud of where they came from, but that doesn't mean that they don't have a American culture still. So no one's telling somebody from Mexico you can't be proud of your heritage. We're saying that you need to be part of the American culture. The same way I have ancestors that came from Jamaica. I like the Jamaican culture. I think it's interesting. It's part of my heritage, but I'm an American, and as American, I'm part of the American culture. So you can acknowledge your past and your history and your background, but still be part of the American culture and assimilated. So I don't understand why those two things can't happen at the same time: assimilation and also respecting and liking one's own culture. You can do the same. You can do both of those things at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive, but here in critical race theory, they make them mutually exclusive, and in actuality, creating more tension. They're sort of telling people that they should be upset if they're asked to assimilate and be part of the American culture. And it's funny because he mentions that it is good for immigrants to assimilate because it gives them economic opportunity. So what he's recognizing is that when people assimilate, they have better opportunities. So he's actually hurting them by telling them not to assimilate, or that assimilating is a negative thing. So I don't see why assimilation is a problem. And as he points out, it's harmful if you don't assimilate. And again, it's not an attack on who you are, your culture, or roots. It's asking you to become part of the American fabric and the American culture. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Another thing he says here, supporters of Proposition 187 by non-whites may be attributable to the opportunity it gives non-whites to ascend in society's racial hierarchy. Latino self-inclusion in the community of citizens lessens their lower status within the racial hierarchy of whites and non-whites. So this goes back to the idea that you can be, say, for example, black, but support white supremacy. You can be a Latino and support Proposition 187. You're doing it not because you think that there should be the rule of law, like we mentioned before, or that immigrants shouldn't be given things for free if they're here illegally. They're saying here that the motivation for is that if they participate in supporting Proposition 187, that they're raising up their own status, that they're, as he says here, we're ascending in the racial hierarchy. Again, I find this pretty cynical when, if you support basic principles like the liberal jurisprudence and not a colorblind society, that now you're basically some Uncle Tom, you're a sellout looking to gain favor among the white society and raise your own status. And so if you wonder why there's so much anger and frustration and nastiness from the left, this is why. They're being taught these ideas that if you even cooperate, if you're even neutral on things, you're supporting white supremacy. You're trying to buy your way into being part of the accepted white culture. You're trying to move up vertically in these different classes of acceptance. So this is where all this animosity and hatred comes from. Ideas like this that tell you basically that everything you're doing is either you're supporting white supremacy and you're a bad person, or you're trying. And if you're not doing that, you gotta be on this side where you're attacking it. And if you're trying to stay neutral, well, we'll just sell you back over onto the white supremacy side. So you're forced into this issue where you're forced into this this fight, and this idea that you have to pick a side. And that's what they're doing. And that's what we see now with Antifa and Black Lives Matter. What do they say? If your silence is violence. And what does silence is violence mean? It means we're not giving you a choice. If you don't get on our side, you're with the oppressors and you're a bad person. So I hope that's, going over this really explains to you why we have so much this tumultuous culture right now where everything is very divisive and angry. This is why these left-wing philosophies, critical race theory, it breeds resentment and breeds anger and it breeds destabilization. And that's my fear for this country, is that we're going to have more and more destabilization. And like I pointed out in my other video, they point to South Africa as being a model of what we could become if they don't get what they think is their share of the power in this country, that we will have a cataclysmic-like events where things just rip apart at the seams. And that's their warning to us. Either we give them what they want, or things will fall apart. And unfortunately, things may be falling apart right now. And that's why we on the right, we're fighting back right now to try to prevent this from happening. Unfortunately, we have Biden in the White House and this COVID-19 pandemic, which is giving them a lot of cover to do a lot of the things that they want to do to consolidate their power. And this issue at the border, again, more people coming across this border, more potential future voters for the Democrat Party. And unfortunately, it also leads to more balkanization, destabilization, and that's the problem. Well, that's it for now. Again, if you are new to this channel, please like and subscribe, and look forward to some more videos on critical race theory. And I think I have one more video to do on the Great Reset. I'll see you then.